I'm sure many of you saw the recent report out of the UK about them adjusting completely their needs. This is really quite important. If you remember, that was the report that said there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. They've adjusted that number in the UK to 20,000. So 500,000 to 20,000. We're looking into this in great detail to understand that adjustment. I'm going to say something that's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that we can all understand it together. In the model, either you have to have a large group of people who are asymptomatic, who've never presented for any test, in order to have the kind of numbers that were predicted. To get to 60 million people infected, or 6 million people infected, you have to have a large group of asymptomatics, because in no country to date have we seen an attack rate over 1 in 1,000. So either we're only measuring the tip of the iceberg of the symptomatic cases, and underneath it are a large group of people. So we're working very hard to get that antibody test, because that's a good way to figure out who are all these people under here and do they exist. Or we have the transmission completely wrong. So these are the things we're looking at, because the predictions of the models don't match the reality on the ground in either China, South Korea, or Italy. We are about 5 times the size of Italy. So if we were Italy and you did all those divisions, Italy should have close to 400,000 deaths. They're not close to achieving that. So these are the kinds of things we're trying to understand. Models are models.
The models do not line up with what we've seen as reality so far. That's Dr. Deborah Birx, who I think has become, for some people, I mean, it's Birx and Fauci, obviously, who are at the press conference, that are both providing a tremendous amount of really useful information. And by the information is quite useful. We're all making decisions, at least in particularly affected areas. I know for a lot of you, this is mostly right now an economic issue, because there are counties where there are 0 cases of this that are at least known so far. But understand that there will be some cases in a whole lot more counties, and the economic reality of the what this is doing in cities is something that affects the whole country. So that's obviously why we're all in this together, even if you're in a place where, you know, you see 2 people a week outside your own family and you don't think that there's any real threat of COVID infecting, you know, your township, which has 200 residents, right? So for those who are in areas like that, I understand you're looking at this like, why do we have to, has the response been as extreme as possible? And the real turning point here was Italy. And honestly, it was that there were 2 moments that I saw where my analysis of this had to ratchet up. And it was when we first saw real data out of Italy. And it was it's very hard with China and looking at all the modeling. And you have so many different factors that come into play when people are talking about how bad this will be. There are some who very clearly act with some degree of bad faith and do not, that they want this to be on the worst side, at least for the administration. They want to make sure they can blame the administration, and it needs to be pretty bad for that to be the case. We've been aware of that from the beginning. People have been blaming Trump from before there was even a response. I was on the Bill Maher show, and we had not a single U.S. death from COVID-19, and they're saying that Trump botched the response, and he's terrible, and we're all going to die. And I'm looking at them saying, I don't even understand how we can have this conversation before we know what has happened. But they hate Trump, and that's all that really matters to them. It's very difficult to make assessments, good assessments of this based on the Chinese data, because we know the Chinese are lying, and we know that the Chinese Communist Party is ruthless. I mean, China is a modern state. It's the 2nd wealthiest country in the world now by GDP, and China is a modern state that still has internment camps for the Uyghurs in Western China. So we understand it's a deeply immoral country. I mean, they execute people for corruption and no one even really knows what the person did. I mean, there's all kinds of, it's a thugocracy, a really powerful one. In fact, it's very similar in a lot of ways to what you have in Russia, where instead in Russia, it's concentrated in Putin and his circle of cronies, but it's really Putin. In China, it's just a committee instead of an individual, but really wields the same absolute power and authoritarianism. And so in the early days, they were suppressing information coming out of China as much as they possibly could. So it was very hard to make real determinations. It wasn't until we saw what happened in Italy, then it was, okay, this is going to be a real threat to our elderly and immunosuppressed populations. And then when President Trump said that we were doing the shutdown of all travel from Europe that night, that was the other shoe dropping for me. All of that said, here we are now deeper into this crisis, and there are still people who are putting out what I would consider to be very irresponsible projections about what is likely to happen. What is possible to happen is not really relevant. What could theoretically occur is not something that should be widely publicized. You know what could happen? In any given year, a flu virus could mutate, and all of a sudden we have a global pandemic that, comes out of nowhere. I mean, that could happen tomorrow. So what could is not something that should get nearly the attention. But from the media, you have two very powerful impulses that affect so much of the way that they're doing their jobs right now. One is maybe it's subconscious, although I think in some it's conscious, but a desire for catastrophe that they can pin on President Trump. And also just the if it bleeds, it leads concept on steroids. Hey, Team Buck, thank you so much for watching The First on YouTube. If you like this video, please click that little thumbs up button so then it will log as liked. And also, if you want to see more great content from The First, please click subscribe.